Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with Dr. Jessie Mahoney
and Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are physicians and leaders who are also trained in coaching, yoga, mindfulness, and integrative medicine.
We are also mothers, spouses, sisters, daughters, aunts, and friends.
In this podcast, we share candid, heart-centered, loving, science-based, thoughtful, and often fun conversations about the challenges life throws at us.
With our collective experience of over 30 years in physician and personal wellness, we reflect and offer pearls of wisdom for navigating life's challenges with more ease.
From parenting, marriages, money scarcity, cancer survivorship, uncertainty, challenges in practicing medicine, we cover it all.
We invite you to refresh your perspective and empower yourself with mindset, mindfulness, and other well-being tools that actually work. A quick reminder that nothing in our podcast is medical advice.
Welcome to today's episode, talking about people who think they can't do yoga. Do you think you can't do yoga because of an injury, because you don't like standing on your head, because yoga is too slow, or maybe it's too fast? Do you think you're not flexible enough or strong enough to practice yoga?
Or are you concerned that it might affect your faith in your own religion, or are afraid that you are somehow getting converted into a different religion when you practice yoga?
The intention of this episode is to share what yoga actually is and how yoga can benefit everyone and be accessible to everyone if they want to participate. You will discover that yoga is not what most of us think of in the United States when we talk about yoga and yoga studios. Yoga is about both physiology and philosophy. It's about knowing your own body and listening to it, something most of us have never taken the time to do. And we hope after listening, you will understand better the structure of a yoga class, the purpose of yoga, and how you might find or create a practice of yoga that works for you.
Inviting you to settle into this moment. You can close eyes if it's safe for you to do so, or lower your gaze a few inches in front of you. Or if you happen to be driving, please pay attention to the road. Allowing the mind and the body to be here at the same time. And if you happen to be sitting and it's accessible for you to do so, inviting you to actually stand with your feet hip width distance apart, letting your arms rest at either side of your hips, your hands facing forward. This is actually an asana, one yoga posture. It's a mountain pose, aligning the head atop the neck, atop the shoulders, atop the hips. Perhaps envisioning a string that's pulling the crown of your head upwards towards the sky so that you're standing a bit more upright. Next, noticing the support of the ground beneath your feet. And with that, blinking open eyes, letting the light back in, coming back to this moment in openness to listen.
The inspiration from this podcast came from a conversation I was having this week with a woman who was inviting me to speak and teach yoga at a retreat. And her question was around, well, what happens for the people who think they can't do yoga, or people who have physical incompatibilities with yoga? And it inspired me, my explanation to her as to how yoga was more than just the stretching and the physical moves on a mat, and that everyone could partake in some way, that we should do a podcast on it. So here we are.
Yeah, and this is a perfect topic to discuss because being board certified in integrative medicine and being an integrative pulmonologist, I actually prescribe yoga to many of my patients and also practice it. So I wanted to start off with a citation from the National Center of Complementary and Integrative Health, which is a branch of the National Institutes of Health. That yoga is an ancient and complex practice. It's rooted in Indian philosophy. It began as a spiritual practice and has become a popularized way, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that popularization as well, as a way of promoting physical and mental well being. And so, classical yoga includes many other components, but yoga, as practiced in the United States, actually ends up getting kind of reductionistic in some respects into the physical postures, breathing techniques, and meditation. I want to also highlight that yoga is a spiritual practice. It's a way of living, it's a practice of self study and mind management, it's a way of really being. And to avoid cultural appropriation, I want to acknowledge that yoga is part of Indian culture and heritage. But since the 1990s, yoga in the Western world has been reduced to really like a fitness regime. So I want to name and recognize that there's vast cultural appropriation of yoga in the West and really of many of the non-Caucasian oriented or originated, I should say, healing modalities from the rest of the world. And so that was much of that was from Yoga International.
And I do think while in some parts of the United States, there has been this tremendous cultural appropriation. I think that I like to see it as we're honoring this tradition. And our dear friend Ann Kennard always says things that have been practiced for thousands of years are generally really good for us. And so I do like to think that there are pieces of it. And while in society today, in the 2020s, we have tried to adapt it. And I do think there are many people who are trying to honor the roots of yoga and make it accessible and something that people can practice. And I think my bent on yoga is that there is this philosophy piece, and that piece is so important. And that is missed in most yoga studios who use yoga as exercise. But when you take yoga teacher training, it is always a part of it. And in order for a yoga teacher training to be accredited, it has to have all of those components and all of those teachings. Now, what people choose to do with it is their own choice. I do love this idea that you said that yoga is a way of living. And I think that is really what comes from its original intent, is that yoga is about being intentional and about being aware and about moving through slowly, calmly, and noticing. And a lot about these philosophical ways of doing no harm and being kind and being compassionate. One of the other principles in yoga is called asteya, which is to not steal. And the idea is to not steal from your time by ruminating or focusing, hanging out on Facebook would be stealing from your valuable use of your time. It would also be not being mean to yourself, for example. And yoga actually likes to think, which fits very well into the integrative medicine realm, that even eating poorly is stealing from your health, or choosing not to sleep is stealing from your health. And so there are a lot of really cool principles in yoga that can guide you to a life that's healthier and more present and more mindful and more content. And so what I think is really important when you're thinking about yoga, and I will put in air quotes for those who are listening, is to have a good teacher. And what I think makes a good teacher is someone who understands the philosophy of yoga and who brings that in a practical, accessible way, and who doesn't sort of disregard the origins of yoga. I also think that a good yoga teacher is one who's a good fit for you, just like a good coach. Like there's lots of teachers that are good fits for different people. And I would even say, in my experience, yoga teachers are a different a good fit for you at different times in your life. I've had times where one person's class was really the best fit for me, and then another time where someone else's style was the best fit for me, or it's when I needed to get through this difficult phase. And so realizing this fit, both of personality matches and philosophic approaches, as well as the kind of yoga they choose to teach. And there's a whole podcast on the different kinds of yoga from about a year ago, which I encourage people to listen to if you want to understand that. But I think recognizing the importance of fit and recognizing that yoga, there's so many ways to practice yoga and so many pieces and parts of yoga, that finding the fit for you, the part that resonates, is really relevant. And I think this is where people get off track thinking they can't practice because they haven't found someone who's a fit for their body, their health, and their mindset and emotional state at this time. The other thing I think makes a really good yoga teacher and also allows people who think they can't practice yoga to practice is someone who has a flexible approach and is remembering that just like in life, and many of us in medicine have an all or none, there's a right or wrong way to do things, that yoga actually isn't that way. There's no right way to do yoga. There's no right way to do a specific pose. There are variations and modifications such that even people who are perhaps missing a limb can do yoga. And there's all kinds of tools that you can bring into yoga to help you. And they are not less than, they're actually more than. And there's a zillion ways, for example, to practice tree pose. Obviously, you don't want to get hurt, but within the realm of that, there are lots of different ways. And then I think also a flexible approach to the spirituality and to the mindfulness and to the philosophy. And so we really do have to meet people where they are. And so if you found that you go to class and you're like, wow, I just don't belong here, it's more than likely a philosophical fit or a stylistic fit. Yoga teachers who are good, and I realize that's a judgmental term, but healthy or help anyone be able to enjoy yoga, are also inclusive in the sense that they are non-judgmental. A lot of these same mindfulness tools we talk about, right? They're non-judgmental, they're kind, they're compassionate, they offer and I love this word variations, because modifications means it seems like you can't do it the right way, so you need to modify. But variations is just there's lots of different ways to practice. And so an inclusive teacher who makes it accessible and uses sort of non-judgmental language can make a huge difference. So for people who feel like, wow, I'm not flexible, and a teacher who brings in lots of blocks and just makes that parts of their teaching and always offers different modifications. I'm teaching outside a lot this summer. And so I will often say, well, you can use the fence or you can use your blocks. Inside, I often say you can use the couch arm or something like that. And I think we get stuck on there's a way to do it. And yet, if Zoom yoga's taught us anything, is there's lots of different ways to do yoga. I also think that if you're going to engage in yoga or you think you haven't enjoyed it, working with a teacher who understands yoga, and especially if you're in healthcare, who understands the human body and anatomy and physiology, can make it much more accessible to you. So I don't think you need to work with a doctor yoga teacher, though if you're a physician, I think that makes the yoga resonate much more. But to have someone who understands the human body in a way that your brain understands it can be really helpful in making the connections and making you enjoy something.
You can also work with a yoga therapist where they personalize, right, the practice. So
and
yeah, lots of different ways.
I think that's actually a really important distinction. So yoga teachers and yoga therapists have very different training, and yoga therapy is really designed to address limitations or health conditions through yoga. And so it's an amazing resource. And I won't say all insurances, but some insurances do help with coverage for that, because it is, for example, if you think about low back pain or some very specific injuries, there's a lot of evidence around how it can minimize the cost of care and improve outcomes. So yes, yoga therapy is an amazing approach. And yoga therapists have a whole other layer of training around anatomy and physiology and pathophysiology in particular. The other things that I think are really important that I think many people who just pop into a yoga class at a gym don't understand is that yoga teachers need to understand trauma. There's a lot of trauma held in our body. And so a lot of what we do in yoga is heal trauma. But if you are not aware of trauma and you teach in a way that evokes more trauma, that can actually be harmful for people. And so sometimes people are like, well, I can't do yoga because I can't sit there and be still. And it brings up things. And so understanding what works for you and what doesn't. Maybe closing your eyes works and maybe closing your eyes doesn't work because of trauma. Or sometimes choosing spots in a room can make it work. Whereas if your back is to the door, for example, and you have a history of trauma, that can be very challenging, or if the door needs to be open or closed. And so understanding that and setting yourself up with someone who you can either talk to or a situation that feels comfortable. It doesn't mean that yoga is out forever. Just understanding there's so many different ways of doing it, so many different environments. Zoom yoga is different than YouTube yoga, is different than outdoor yoga, is different than one-on-one yoga, is different than all kinds of things. So the key thing in yoga is to do no harm. And I think it's always possible to practice in some way to do no harm. So the other thought I wanted to bring into this for people who think they can't do yoga, I often get requests to do shorter classes because I only have so much time. And so that is very much an all or none approach to yoga. And yet you can always do part of a yoga class. If you understand the structure of yoga, then you can choose the parts of it that work for you and the time that works for you. I think many people, when they've think that they have to do the whole class and everything has to go in a certain series. And yes, you don't want to go standing on your head without warming up. But I think there's lots of bits of it that could meet your needs for a certain day. And I think we often think, oh, well, I didn't practice yoga because all I did was Shavasana. Well, that's actually counts as practicing yoga. So if you can lie on the floor, you can practice yoga, for example. And so I think understanding that you don't have to do all or none, and that you don't have to be able to do a whole class of a certain type, or maybe you need to bring in a chair to help you. And I used to think that chair yoga was actually kind of gentle yoga or old person yoga. I've been doing a lot of chair yoga recently with my yoga teacher, and chair yoga is a lot harder than some of the other yoga that I have done. It's a lot more Pilates-like and takes a lot more balance. And so I think just realizing there's a zillion ways to practice yoga, and probably the way you've thought about it is very narrow-minded. And if you just open your eyes to all the different ways and all the different straps and tools and walls and bolsters and amazing things, that it's not an all or none, and there's so much variety. I did want to reflect a bit on the basic structure of yoga because it has come to my attention that people don't know how a yoga class is built. And I share this a lot with people I work with one-on-one, because a lot of them will do my yoga classes on YouTube. And when you understand the anatomy, YouTube's amazing because you can just fast forward to the part that your body needs, for example. So you can fast forward to Shavasana. Yoga classes start with an introduction, and it's usually mindfulness, and it's usually grounding in some way, most of the time seated. And it's a chance really to drop into your body. And so if you're just feeling super scattered, do the first 5 minutes of a yoga class. That counts, and you can get benefit from it. From the introduction, then we usually start with some kind of gentle stretching, moving. Sometimes in the traditional exercise world, we'd call it warm up. I don't actually think about it that way. I think about it as practicing being in your body. And the more you practice, the better at it you become. And so it's really more gentle movement, and it's usually seated, but not always. And so if you're someone who is healing a foot injury, for example, those first two parts of yoga will be totally accessible to you. Doesn't mean that you don't have to practice yoga for 6 months if you are in a boot or healing an injury. You can actually practice yoga from bed, honestly. You can do a whole yoga class on your back if you want. The next part of yoga is more of that movement part. So that's where you get into downward dog, and maybe you go up and down if you're in a vinyasa class. I don't actually love that. And for those people who've been joining me recently, I am recovering from a significant upper respiratory infection. And so going upside down does not feel that great. So most of my recent classes are not up and down. And in fact, there's a lot more staying upright and minimizing the sort of flow up and down. I have had people who join me on retreats who actually have vertigo from going up and down. And there are ways to teach a whole class or change your positioning in different ways such that even those people can practice yoga. It just looks different. And so a lot of this is understanding what your issue is and where the challenge is. After the what I think most people think of as traditional yoga, which is vinyasas or downward dogs or high lunge or warrior poses, for example, there's a component that most people throw in called the balance component. Sometimes you've put that into the other. So if you have issues with balance or tipping over would be dangerous, you just skip that part or you hold on to the wall, for example, and you keep your eyes open because it's a lot easier to balance with your eyes open. And then the next part is what in traditional Western cultural appropriated yoga would be the cool down, which I would just say is the slower part. It's the lying on your back. It's the resting. It's the coming, noticing your heartbeat slow. It's allowing yourself to slow down and to experience what that feels like. And for many of us who really struggle to slow down, it's possible in that part of the class because you've moved. And for me, that's one of the reasons I came to yoga is it was really hard to just sit on a mat and be mindful. But I could drop into my body as I moved and someone told me what to do and I could do it slowly. I've had people talk to me about the slowness of my yoga classes and they're like, I just can't do that slow. And I'm like, that's the whole point is to practice. And so recognizing that it's going to be uncomfortable and maybe you do the middle part that has more movement until you get used to it, for example. And then the last part's the shavasana. Yeah.
That their slowness of your classes lends itself very nicely into what you call all of your offerings as mindful yoga classes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think that in general, yoga is basically mindfulness in motion
Yeah.
in some
Mindful
respects.
movement. Mindful
Yes.
movement. Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily always get practiced that way. Like very quick vinyasa classes, for instance, you barely have enough
time to catch your breath.
Catch your breath and also to even like recognize which asana or pose that you're in before you shift and transition into the next one. So there is a very much intentionality behind the pace of your yoga classes that I definitely enjoy as mindful movement.
And I think for listeners to understand that if you haven't enjoyed a quick vinyasa class or a power yoga or a hot yoga, that does not mean yoga is not for you. In fact, at different times in your life, you may need different. And that mindful yoga is a very different thing. And hatha yoga is a kind of yoga where you hold poses longer. I actually call my yoga mindful yoga because it's kind of hatha yoga, gentle yoga, yin yoga, incorporates mindfulness. And so again, there's so many different ways to practice and so many different teachers. And my way may not work for lots of people, by the way. But it's to figure out what you need. And because most of our listeners here are in healthcare, most of us need to slow down. And for most of us, it's very uncomfortable when we do. So they're like, yeah, but that yoga is uncomfortable. Why would I do that? Mm-hmm. And my thought is that's probably what you need. And remembering that our healthcare doctor brain says if it's uncomfortable, it's dangerous, but it might not be. It's actually just unfamiliar.
And talking about discomfort, in our zones of safety, when we teach mindfulness, the zone of challenge where you're feeling some of that discomfort, that is where the learning takes place. That's where potentially progress and growth can happen, knowing that we also don't want to go into our zone of overwhelm. So you spoke about trauma. So like we definitely don't want to evoke trauma responses if we can help it in these integrative modalities.
And as you mentioned, the zone of challenge. So for a lot of us, we think of the challenge as like, I'm going to do the crow pose or I'm going to stand on my head. But for many of us, the challenge can be going slow. Mm-hmm. And the challenge can be pausing in a position and standing there literally in mountain pose, as we did in the beginning here, and coming into your body. And that can be a challenge because we are go, go, go urgent people. And that feels very uncomfortable.
And maybe the challenge is also to choose for yourself a variation of a posture that's being offered that is perhaps less intense.
I would say that for most of us who are high achievers, choose the easier one, the one your brain says is easier, and be content and proud and own it. What comes to mind is tree pose with your foot on the ground, right? The kickstand. I see so many people I work with who are like, I got to get that foot all the way up into my groin as high as I can because that's the better pose. And yet, for many of us, keeping our foot on the floor is what our brain and body need to become into unity, which is one of the main tenets of yoga. And so, what I'm really hoping people will understand is that yoga is a purposeful, deliberate thing to do. And it was purposeful and deliberate in the Indian culture when it was created. And it should be purposeful and deliberate here. And it's about bringing mind and body into the same place. And that's that beginning piece. It's also the end piece, which I realize I forgot to talk about Shavasana, which is the most important part because it's the integration part. And most of us in healthcare, we don't integrate. We move to, next patient, next patient, next patient, next patient. And so taking time to integrate in between, to drop into your body, I think is really, really important. The other thing is to think about yoga as care for your nervous system. I won't say healthcare, but care for your nervous system, tending to your nervous system, getting it out of overwhelm, fight or flight, sympathogenic storm, and maybe balancing it and growing your parasympathetic nervous system. And notice I didn't go to all or none. It's just growing it little by little by little, 1%, 5%. It can take a lot of time. It's also about shifting perspective and balancing I'll say your outlook. So balancing maybe our negativity bias and balancing patience versus urgency and balancing judgment versus non-judgment and striving versus non-striving. We often talk the balance between ease and effort. And so it's really about balancing all of those things, not as a like teeter totter, I have to hold it tight in balance, but finding this easeful balance within. And the byproduct of all of that is it builds some strength and it builds flexibility and it builds also, I would say, mental strength and flexibility. But that's not the initial intent of it.
I'm going to name that for healthcare professionals. Yoga classes offered in healthcare systems for healthcare professionals, unfortunately, has been used somewhat like a band-aid to give healers something else to do without addressing systemic issues. Like, try to fit in this class on top of all of your other clinical duties. So, what here in the Mindful Healthcare Collective and in our Mindful Healers podcast, we're seeking to invite you to be open to this evidence-based modality that has the potential to help you downshift, to expand your parasympathetic being, to help to potentially decrease stress enough for you perhaps to improve your health and well-being, and also for those of your patients.
And it doesn't mean that if you do yoga, you will be well, or it doesn't give the healthcare system a pass. It's still broken. It's really a tool to help you take better care of you. And that's how I like to think about it. It's you just owning what feels good to you. I think that, especially as a wellness chief, it was sort of sold for so long, we'll do some yoga and you'll feel better. Or we'll offer a yoga class at lunch and that will be our wellness. And so I think it also has a bit of a bitter flavor. It has a flavor like resilience to me, which is just be more resilient. And yet it is a tool that can feel so amazing if you choose to use it for you. And do it for you regardless of what's happening in the healthcare system and regardless of what your patients need. There are so many evidence-based studies that it can help you no matter what underlying health conditions you have.
And always, though, like any other healing modality, if it still doesn't resonate, even after trying some different variations, teachers, different types, please give yourself permission to opt out without judgment.
I love that. And I think, the encouragement here is that anyone can practice yoga, but if you're doing it and you still hate it, I think we also have this idea that we should do things we hate because they're good for us. Don't do that. Find a part you like, or find a teacher you like, or even just email me and ask your question about yoga. And you don't have to torture yourself just because it's good for you.
So, as always, we like to end with some reflection questions for you. What are your thoughts about yoga? Inviting you to notice any judgment about the practice or yourself practicing yoga that arises. And what are some of your barriers to trying it or practicing it a little bit more regularly?
Thanks so much for listening today. We hope this has inspired you to try yoga in whatever way it works for you. And a reminder that I teach free yoga on Zoom almost every week and have been doing so since the beginning of the pandemic when the Mindful Healthcare Collective was born. And I would love to have you join me. If you go to my website and you click the yoga tab, there you sign up for the link and you get the schedule changes if there happen to be any. And those classes are all also recorded. So they have become quite a robust YouTube channel. And so if the time of the live classes doesn't work for you, you can take them on YouTube. And if you do sign up for the list, you get copies of newly recorded classes and notifications when something else new is showing up. So I would love to have you join me in both of those virtual spaces. And then a nudge to join us for Connect in Nature in September. It'll be our last one that offers yoga in person in Muir Woods, which is a magical experience. And we have a couple of spots left for that. You can also join me for a shorter retreat at Pie Ranch where we just do one yoga class in person, but yoga in person is amazing. Or a longer retreat where you do yoga, all the kinds, and find something that works for you. We actually practice twice a day. So mindful yoga, restorative yoga, yin yoga, sound healing, all of the things. And it's a great opportunity for people to find bits and pieces of yoga that work for them. You don't have to be a yogi to join. You don't have to have had a yoga practice. You don't have to have ever practiced yoga. I've had people join me for week-long retreats who've never done any yoga, and they figure it out and they find things and ways that they can upregulate their parasympathetic nervous system and downshift their stress always. So I would love to have you join me. We'll put links for everything in the show notes. A quick reminder to all our listeners, if you would please, please, please share the podcast and leave us some stars and reviews. We haven't asked in a while, but they do help other people find the podcast. So if you find this podcast valuable and you're a regular listener, we know we have a lot of regular listeners, please leave a stars and reviews on Apple Podcasts so that other people who might enjoy the podcast and benefit from these conversations can find us.
Thanks so much for joining us.
We encourage you to dive into the show notes for each episode for more learnings and resources.
We also invite you to take a listen to the many other Mindful Healers podcast episodes. And please share the podcast far and wide with colleagues, friends, and family.
If our message and approach resonate with you, we would love to work with you.
When you listen to a podcast, you consume information, but when you work with us, you can actually practice and change.
We offer coaching and mindfulness experiences, talks, workshops, retreats, and more. Connect with us at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
The content of this podcast is not medical or life advice. We invite you to participate in the mindful moments we offer at the end of most of our podcasts, but please only do so safely.
Welcome to today's mindful moment. Today's moment will be a mindful movement exercise in the spirit of yoga being available and accessible to anyone. If it is safe for you to do so, close your eyes and put down anything in your hands. And wherever you are, notice your feet on the ground if you are sitting or standing. Wiggling toes, noticing the four corners of your feet and every smidge of the soles of your feet. And coming up in through your legs to your belly, up into your chest, checking out how you feel. Taking in a big deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. With eyes closed, if that's available, and with eyes open, if not, and only if it's safe. Shrug your shoulders all the way up to your ears. Drop your occiput into the shoulders. Squeeze as tight as you absolutely can. Tight, tight, tight. Notice all the sensations. Exhale, drop your shoulders. Notice how it feels. Draw both shoulders back, pinching your scapula together. Notice how it feels. Bringing your shoulders back together. Taking another big deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Inhaling and reaching your arms out and up towards the sky, bringing your right thumb and middle finger around the left wrist, reaching tall. Exhale to the right and enjoy your left side body. Inhale, come back to center. Switch hands, tip to the left. Inhale, back to center. Opening arms out, clasp your hands at your sacrum and press your fists towards the floor. If you're sitting, you may want to stand. You can do this in a chair. With hands clasped at the sacrum, drop your chin to your chest and enjoy your neck. 2 breaths here. One more. Releasing hands, shaking them out. Reaching your arms out to the sides and wrapping yourself in a huge hug, bringing your fingers to the medial scapula, squeezing tight, tight, tight. Drop chin to chest once again and enjoy your neck. Inhale, untangle your arms. Press your hands into the sidewalls. Wrists are flexed. Spread fingers wide. Notice the energy coming in through your fingers. Relax your hands. Wrap yourself in a huge hug the other way. Maybe tighter. Wiggle your fingers towards the medial scapula, squeezing as tight as you can, lifting elbows up over your chest, drop your chin to chest, and enjoy your neck. Big breath in and out. Chin coming back to neutral. Untangle your arms. Lower hands by your sides. Shrug shoulders up to ears. Pinch your scapula together. Bring your occiput into the shoulders. Tight, tight, tight. Wiggle fingers. Exhale, release your hands and let your palms fall towards the front and enjoy. Big breath in and out. Bring a hand to heart and another hand to top. Practice of self-compassion. Yoga is always a practice of self-compassion. Notice your heart under your hands, breathing into the back side of the hands. Huge, long, deep exhale, enjoy. Lowering hands, opening eyes, and coming back together. I hope that little refresh feels amazing, and we'll see you next week.